Welcome, everybody, to the ABT Time podcast. This is the 27th episode of our wonderful show. Today, we're not going to have our co-host, Jen Martin from Melbourne, Australia. This is going to be a very unusual episode, unlike any of the other 26 episodes we've had in the past, in that we've got two great guests. And this is kind of an inner circle episode. I will make no bones about it. If you're not that keen on fishermen, and especially fishermen on the coast of Maine, then this may not be the show for you. But if you think they're awesome, then this is really going to be a treat for you. We've got several different parts that we're going to go through. We're going to start off with sort of a public health service story for you that has just taken place in the last 4 or 5 days here for me. It's kind of fascinating. And then from there, I'll be bringing on my first guest, my warm-up guest, Ed. And then we'll set up eventually for our feature guest, Brian. So lots of details to come as we get deeper into all of this. So here is segment one, which is, this is going to be about a public health issue that we kind of feel the desire to share with you, because I guarantee you most of the people listening know next to nothing about this issue. And I'm also going to be, as you know, this is the ABT Time podcast. Reminder with the mug there, ABT Time. And as a result, the part of the agenda with this podcast is to talk about story structure as we tell you stories. And by the way, the main reason we're having both of these guys on today is these are two of the best storytellers I've known my entire life. So close friends, and you'll be hearing plenty of stories. But this opening bit has a very clear structure to it. And so for all of you who have done the ABT course, which is more than 500 graduates at this point, to put it into the language that you've learned in there, this is straight out of the monomyth structure. So you know about the two worlds, the ordinary world that's all peaceful and happy and there's no problems going on, and then the transition into the special world. This is exactly what I went through last Thursday evening. I was sitting around in my ordinary world last Thursday afternoon, evening, having had a wonderful afternoon surf and the afternoon glass off and just making myself some dinner at 7 p.m. And I looked down at my iPhone and there were two text messages. The first one was from Shane, old buddy of mine in Kansas City, who is a filmmaker. And he was, let me just read you what his text message said. So this is it verbatim. And his business partner is Ed Leydecker, who's our first guest here. And Ed is one of my old college buddies from the University of Kansas from a long time ago. We were freshmen together and have been close buddies over the years, a million different adventures we've taken together. Haven't seen him for 2 or 3 years. And so Shane texted me this message. He said, "Hey, Randy, Ed is about to call you. He's stuck at LAX airport and a bit drunk. He's going to call you. I can also fill you in. We need to get him picked up. He was en route to a shoot." So these guys are filmmakers, and he was en route to a shoot in Sacramento. The crew had to go ahead thinking he would be on the next flight. I'm worried about him and hope you can talk to him. See what you think. It's almost like he got roofied, meaning somebody put a drug into his drink at the bar. They're doing a big interview tomorrow, and I'm back here in Kansas City. Let me know what you find out. So that was the first text message. And the second message was a voice message, which was transcribed here. And it was from Ed. He said, "Hey man, give me a call when you get a chance. I'm in LA. I need your help later. Bye." And then the next message just said, "Hey, call ASAP" in capitals. So I'm wondering what in the world is going on. And then I called Shane, and Shane began to fill me in a bit on something bad happened at LAX in the morning. They had flown out. Ed and 2 camera crew guys had landed at 9 in the morning at LAX, gone to the bar and had a Bloody Mary and then a second Bloody Mary. And that was it, over the course of 2 hours, which is not a lot of alcohol. And Ed had gone to the restroom. And when he came back, he all of a sudden seemed kind of out of it and weird. And it was time for them to board their flight. While they were standing in line waiting to get on the flight attendants came over and said, "This guy's clearly drunk. We're not going to let him on the flight." So he was clear and coherent. He was kind of surprised they were even saying that, but I guess he'd kind of leaned on one of the guys a little bit. And so the 2 guys said, "All right, no big deal. we're going to get you on the next flight. They booked him on a flight at 1 o'clock, 2 hours later, and said, you just sit down here and sober up. And Ed had apparently said, yeah, no problem. Just leave me right here. And they got on the flight and went ahead. Well, 8 hours went by from 11 a.m. till 7 p.m. when I got that text. And we have no idea what went on those 8 hours. And when I talked to Ed, he had no idea what had gone. I was saying, what have you been up to? What have you been doing there? And he said, I don't know. You know, he did not even remember being denied boarding during those 8 hours. And he was clearly rattled by it. So we set up, and eventually I got him taking an Uber to Santa Monica. I picked him up there and brought him to my house. Then I began texting a ER doctor friend of mine who said, take him to Cedars-Sinai emergency room first thing in the morning, get in there as early as you can before all the crowd comes in. They've got the best doctors. They've got an MRI machine in the emergency room, the only one in town where you can get an MRI without having to be admitted into the hospital. So we did that first thing next morning. And, you know, he was still just really in a daze, like, what in the world? Why do I not remember 8 hours at LAX? And still, one of the prevailing ideas that we had was that somebody had slipped something into his drink. It was all so weird. So we come into the emergency room, and there's 3 nurses there at the very beginning, admitting things, say, what are you here for? And he begins telling the story. I was at LAX and there's 8 hours that I can't remember what went on. And one of the nurses instantly said, I think I know exactly what this is. Transient global amnesia, TGA. And she said, I have had 2 friends in the last couple of years who have had exactly the same thing happen. They've had this blank out period for 6 to 8 hours that they don't know what went on, and they can't tell you where they were, anything like that. So they checked him in. The doctors came and started seeing him, and several doctors came and interviewed him over and over again. And they began to come to the exact same conclusion. This sounds like TGA. So if you're listening, you know, we'll put the link to the Wikipedia page for this TGA with the notes for the show. And you should read over that. It is utterly fascinating. And what it tells you is that this is a phenomenon. They don't know what causes it. 94% of the people that experience it never experience it again. Doesn't seem to be anything serious. And the Wikipedia page says verbatim, tends to last for 2 to 8 hours. Ed's period was exactly 8 hours. And on that note now, Ed Leydecker, my longtime best buddy from Kansas, do you want to activate your microphone and camera and join me here? And we'll talk a little bit about this crazy experience that you had. Ed, what do you remember from those 8 hours?
Nothing. It was really strange at the time, you know, when we as we followed up and trying to figure out the string of text and the phone calls that I had during that time period. But it was evidently I was operating, and I supposedly talking to people, and I have no recollection absolutely at all. And, you know, normally after a big shoot, we may go out and have a few more beers than a couple, of course, but it was early in the morning. We had a couple of Bloody Marys, and then, you know, I just walked to the restroom. So it all seemed so unusual. And the very next thing I do remember was having a taxi cab driver drive me close to or take me to Randy's house. And it was really discomforting. It was the brain was just blank, and I have no recollection. I can't imagine where I was in LAX airport for 8 hours. And we tried to follow back and tried to find out where I was. Nobody knows.
And one of the fascinating things, we began reading up, and again, you know, if you find this intriguing, search it, TGA, transient global amnesia. And you begin reading about it. And one of the things they say is that people who experience it during the 8 hours that they have no memory of usually are completely functional. Everybody around them didn't know anything was wrong with them. It's just that the next day they can't tell you what happened in those 8 hours. And it kind of dawned on us, it's a little bit like being a blackout drunk to some extent. There's lots of people that end up drinking a lot and they're still fairly coherent. They can't remember what happened the night before. And that seems to be the same thing, because the way we're thinking is that had he been acting weird all day long, somebody in security would have come across him and said, you know, let's take you to the first aid station here or something. But that didn't happen at all. So we don't know what happened for those 8 hours, but clearly he was functional. He was probably sitting and chatting with people and being his normal self. The next morning, as I drove him to the ER, I was having conversations with him about things that we did 30 years ago, and he was crystal clear. They're and right now, same old Edmundo, absolutely no signs of any. It's not like a stroke. That's the main thing. That was what we were wondering. Was this kind of a stroke? No, it's different from a stroke. Again, it's TGA. Read about it. Very strange. And how do you feel right now, Ed?
I feel good now. I was actually afraid yesterday because I think about all the travel we do, and I'm just glad I wasn't in a dangerous situation or on a third world country. But, having walked around LAX airport evidently for all those hours, and this is during the corona, so we were all wearing masks. So maybe if I wouldn't have had that mask on, maybe there would have been a telltale sign of what was going on with me. But my two guys who I've worked with for a long time both looked at me, and they insisted, or I insisted, that they go on to the film shoot because it was a very important shoot. But they said they had no indication. They never would have left me there. And I think they felt bad when they got to the location. But after talking to these doctors for this period of time at Cedars-Sinai, which, I can't compliment them enough. These doctors were absolutely amazing. And the tests that they ran on me are probably the most extensive physical test I've ever had in my life. They saw no signs of, what scared me because I thought I had a stroke or something. I just couldn't understand it. But my tests are here in front of me, and my physical condition's incredible for my age. So I sit here and look at this, and I had no idea what this was. And so when the doctors, all three of them, made a comment about it, it obviously is something that we're seeing more and more of. My initial indication was, I had the coronavirus over a year ago, and I'm kind of a long hauler in some ways. I've lost some of my taste, some of my smell that hasn't totally come back yet. So I was thinking that maybe it's attributable to some of that, but I don't know. Nobody knows.
Yeah. And that's probably about as far as we can push this thing. Again, everybody, look at those links, look at the Wikipedia page. It's utterly fascinating. So, on that note, then we'll set that aside. That's our public health service for everyone. And now we want to get started with laying the groundwork for our special guest, Brian Robbins, who is lifetime resident in the coast of Maine. He is both was a lobster fisherman his younger years and writer, and very accomplished writer, and our good buddy for 30 years. So let me give a little bit of background on how I found my way to Brian Robbins, Fisherman, because there's so little overlap in common in our backgrounds. And it all begins when I was doing my dissertation work and then postdoctoral work in Australia on the Great Barrier Reef in the 1980s. And I spent over a year of my life living on an island on the north end of the Great Barrier Reef, Lizard Island. That's where I was doing this work in coral reef ecology. And one of the amazing things that took place at Lizard Island was it's a beautiful island with 37 white sand beaches and two smaller islands next to it that help form a big lagoon there. And the crazy thing about the Great Barrier Reef, for those of you who've been there, you really probably know about this. We used to sit around and laugh about how the reef is kind of protected from overexploitation from tourists, because 9 months of the year, it's bloody horrible. The wind blows, the southeast trade winds from those 9 months, about 20 to 30 knots just constantly. And you take a boat outside the lagoon and you're just getting thrashed up and down. And I just talked to somebody a couple of weeks ago who was there as a tourist and went out on a dive trip from Cairns, Cairns out to the outer reef. It was like an hour boat ride. And he said everybody got beaten to pieces. The wind chop and swell was so big, and it was just a miserable experience. In the end, that's the protection the reef has. As a result, in that lagoon, you get boats that would come in and anchor. And I first went there 40 years ago, right now, basically 1981. And it was not very developed at all there the way that it is today. And there was no internet. It was a whole different world. It was an exciting place to be. It was very isolated. The laboratory there that was run by Sydney University had only, or maybe I think the Australian Museum, sorry about that, had only 3 houses. One was for the director, one was for the engineer, and one was for short time visitors that were there for just a few days. And then there was one lab building and one kind of workshop down on the beach. As I was picked up at the airstrip, there are only like a couple flights a week that would come up there. The director's wife picked me up and drove me down to the workshop and then pointed down the beach. And there were 3 tents there. And she said, that far one is yours. You're going to live here for a year in a tent on the beach. And I was really kind of offended as she drove away. And I sat there listening to the wind whistling through the casuarina trees and that trade wind. But it turned out to be the most wonderful year of my life, because what more could you ask for, living on a tent on the beach for a year, where every morning you'd wake up to the breeze blowing into the tent and the flaps opening up and closing and looking out there at the reef that you're going to dive on in the next few hours. So day in and day out, I was diving on that reef. And one of the coolest things of living on Lizard Island was that fishing boats would come by and they would anchor in the lagoon, and the fishermen would come ashore, and they would kind of seek shelter there by anchoring for overnight. And they would come ashore and walk down the beach, and they would bring with them, especially mackerel fishermen. They'd bring a couple mackerel that they just caught, or coral trout or something like that. And there was a barbecue pit area there right on the beach next to the workshop, where they would bring, a few cases of beer with the fish, and we would crank up a big barbecue there and grill up the fish and then start drinking. And I spent night after night after night sitting around that barbecue pit, listening to those fishermen tell their stories of the high seas. And they were the greatest storytellers that I ever met in my life. And they were hypnotic with their thick Australian accents and their sense of humor and all their wild tales out there on the high seas. And what I'm just trying to think of any of the stories I can remember. One story I remember, 3 mackerel fishermen told us about, like a week earlier, they had been somewhere out in some isolated atoll or sandbar or something, and they'd caught some fish there, and like barracuda, some sort of top level predator. And there's a problem on coral reefs and tropical environments like that of toxic dinoflagellates that top level predators end up concentrating in the process biological magnification, where each level of fish feed on it and concentrate more and more and more. And this stuff called ciguatoxin that comes out of these dinoflagellates, that's this poison. And you get the top level predators, and their muscle is saturated with this poison. And these guys told us that they had cooked up some of those fish, having no awareness at all of what they were doing. And they started eating them, and they could feel their fingers and toes going numb, and then their arms eventually going numb. And the next thing you know, all 3 of them passed out, and they woke up like the next afternoon. They just laid there near dead for almost a day. And the one guy said he got up and looked over his buddies and woke them up, like, what happened? And it wasn't until a few days later that somebody kind of filled them in on there. Here's what probably happened, was you got that ciguatoxin, and just all these crazy stories from these guys. And so I enjoyed their storytelling so much that when I did my last visit to Lizard Island, on the last day, I was at the airstrip, and I said to the people with me, the next time I come back to this island, I'm coming back with a film crew, and we're going to get some of these fishermen telling these stories. Because back then they had documentaries on PBS, and they never could capture anything like just the charisma and hypnotic element of the storytelling of those guys. So I came back to the States with that as a kind of mission in the back of my mind. I became a professor at the University of New Hampshire, and that was kind of agenda item number 1. I want to start getting some practice in on how to make films, because I didn't know the first thing about making a film. And I want to try some practice runs here with local fishermen, because fishermen tell great stories. And about that time, my buddy Eddie here, who's joining me here for the warm-up part, and we'll have him come back in a few minutes. But Ed had we've stayed close friends over the years in a million different adventures. He came down, he spent a whole month, or I think 2 weeks there at Lizard Island, working with my research crew and diving out in the world's best coral reef. So he knew a lot about that, and he met some of those fishermen. And as a result, he came out and visited me there in New Hampshire several times. And he had begun working in filmmaking in Kansas City. And so he would bring film crews out with him, and we began shooting some of these films and starting in on this mission of, let's see if we can find some fishermen on the coast of Maine who tell really great stories. And we interviewed a couple around New Hampshire first off, and they were good guys. And I made a little short humorous film with them, but it wasn't quite the same as those guys I heard around that barbecue pit in Australia. And then I remember we went up in Kittery, Maine, I think it was, and interviewed one lobster fisherman there. And that guy, nice guy, but he was downright boring. He was just basically a technician. He said, well, here's how the traps works. Here I catch the lobsters. Here's where I sell them. Here's on and on and on. no humor, no sense of story, nothing like that. And then there was one more we did some interviews with, and I got to the point where I was getting little disappointed and maybe considering maybe I'm just wrong. Maybe it's only Australian fishermen that are really great storytellers, and that the Americans just don't kind of have that streak in them. But we started hearing about these two brothers, the Robbins brothers, way up the state in a region they call Down East Maine, in a little town of seaside village of Stonington. And over and over again, people said, "Oh yeah, you want some storytellers? You go meet those Robbins brothers." And they would come into port down in Portsmouth in New Hampshire, where I was living, and a bunch of people around there knew them from their antics, as we will get to hear about. And so eventually, Ed and I decided to make a trip up there and try and meet with them. And we got in touch with Brian, who by then was no longer a fisherman. He was working with the Commercial Fisheries News as a writer, and he was in Stonington. So we drove all the way up there, 4 to 5 hours, stayed in a motel the night before, and then the next morning went and met with Brian. And we really wanted to meet with his older brother, Stevie, because Stevie was the legendary guy. He was 6'5" and 300 and some pounds, and loud, bellowing voice, crazy sense of humor. We'd heard from all these people, and the captain of this 55-foot offshore lobster fishing boat, which is pretty rare. They would go out way off the deeper water, catch the big lobsters. And he was a legendary figure, and we knew all about it. Well, we got there, and Brian had told us that Stevie's out of town. That was his whole big excuse. And we learned later that they don't travel a lot up there. That was just a way to fend us off, and they're very suspicious. So this short film I had done before was a 5-minute film. You can actually see it on YouTube. I think we'll post the link to that. It's called Lobsters, and it was a humorous piece. And my initial vision with making that was, I always loved Woody Allen's movie, Everything You Ever Want to Know About Sex But Were Afraid to Ask. So I had this idea, I'm going to make the same thing for lobsters. Everything you ever want to know about a lobster, but we're afraid to ask. And this was a first little 5-minute vignette that would be humorous. And that's what we did. It had some silly scenes in there. We had the scene where Ed is the actor. He's actually at a restaurant. He orders the jumbo lobster, and they bring him this 25-pound lobster they throw down in front of him. And then he's trying to crack his way into it. And then we intercut that with the local lobster fisherman. It was not a great piece of work. I sent it off to one film festival, the New England Film and Video Festival, and with lots of trepidation, thinking, was this even worth the $40 entry fee? And a week later, I showed the film to my good buddy, semi-soulmate, Ron Etter, still a professor at UMass Boston. And he watched it, and Ron was never one to pull punches. He turned to me and said, "This is a piece of shit. What, I hope you didn't spend any money on this." I said, "Well, actually I spent about $3,000 or $4,000. And then he started just howling. "You did what? You spent that money on this? You need to quit. You have no ability as a filmmaker." And I remember driving home from his house that day, just really depressed, like, oh God, where am I going with all this? And then about 2 or 3 weeks later, out of the blue, I get this big package from the film festival. It says, "Congratulations, you won a Judge's Special Merit Award for your film Lobsters." And then it was in the big film festival at the Museum of Fine Arts. And all these artsy documentary filmmakers, feature films, they had about probably 30 or 40 films in there. And they had told me, somebody had told me when I talked to them, they said, "Oh yeah, the morning of the festival, you'll see the Boston Phoenix, the artsy newspaper in Boston, will review all the films of the festival. So you'll want to check that out." So that morning I run to my local grocery store, and I remember picking up the Boston Phoenix, opening it up, finding all the reviews. And the very last little one at the end of that page said, "And this year's humor award goes to the, quote, decidedly lame lobsters." So that was my very first review ever. And it was pretty fitting. Actually, I hope that will be on my tombstone someday. He lived a decidedly lame life. I'm sure that Brian will agree with that. At any rate, Eddie and I met with Brian, and he wouldn't let us talk to Stevie that morning. And he was suspicious of us. And we finished by me giving him a VHS copy of the 5-minute film, and then, said, "Check it out and see if you'll be willing to let us come back and interview you guys for a whole film that I want to make." And we went back to my house in Portsmouth and sat there and waited for about 4 or 5 days. And then finally the phone rang, and there was Brian. And he said, "Well, we pulled the families together in Stevie's living room to check out your film. And we popped a big bowl of popcorn, got all ready for an hour-and-a-half movie. You didn't warn us it was only 5 minutes. And we watched this thing, and at the end of 5 minutes, we just all looked at each other like, what the hell was that? And he said, then we talked it over and we decided, you are so bad as a filmmaker that you must be harmless. Therefore, we're going to go ahead and do this thing with you. And that was the beginning of the project. So about a week later, we pulled together. We flew out a cameraman from Kansas City and then 2 graduate students from University of New Hampshire. Jeff Trussell is now the director of the Nahant Marine Lab, and Sam Lockwood, who's a molecular biologist. And the 5 of us drove up there in the afternoon, and they had set up for us to meet them at 6 p.m. at Stevie's fishing shed that was their fishing shop, whatever. This just little, like an empty shop on the waterfront there in Stonington. And we got there and began loading in the gear. They met us there, and it was the 2 brothers with their father. This fishing shop thing was just a big empty wooden building room that had piles of rope and buoys and lobster traps and all their gear. So it was kind of like their storage shed. And then it had this small room off to the side that it was the building itself was up on stilts above where high tide would rise right up under it. And so there's this little room off to the side, and you go in there, and that was the bathroom. And the only thing it had was a hole that had been drilled in the wall to the outside world, and a Clorox bottle that they'd chopped the bottom off and jammed it in that hole upside down so that it served as a urinal. That tells you everything you need to know about the facilities there. And we brought with us a large amount of alcohol because I felt that this was those nights at those barbecue pits on Lizard Island, or that one barbecue pit at Lizard Island. Those storytelling nights were characterized by lots of alcohol. Everybody just in the mood, loosened up, telling this stuff. So there was no way I wanted to interview these guys telling their stories without plenty of alcohol. But it turned out that Stevie had a favorite, which was Crown Royal whiskey. So we brought a couple of fifths of that and then a whole lot of beer. And the cameraman, Chris Fan, did a great job of pulling together, I think, a few floats and traps for them to sit on and a bunch of the yellow buoys in the background, and lit the thing really nicely. It looked like a movie set. And then we sat down and I began the discussion, and we filmed for about 2.5 hours. And we would go in sessions like 20 minutes, and I would ask a question too. That's all it took. And they would go take off. And the crazy thing was that I was there wanting to make this Woody Allen type of movie that was going to be funny, witty one-liners from down east fishermen. And so I was waiting for them to tell me all their clever little things, and you can't get there from here, and all that sort of tourist type of nonsense. And as the evening went on, they didn't do any of that. And in the back of my mind was this voice of frustration, like, what's happening here? I'm not getting any of these witty one-liners. Yeah, they're telling me these other stories, yada, yada, yada. And I just really, in some ways, wasn't listening as much as I could have been. And we finished that night. Everybody saturated with alcohol. We went to the motel, spent the night there, and drove back the next day. And then over the next few days, I began watching this footage and began letting go of the original vision, which was witty one-liners, which you have to do sometimes in life. You have to let go of the wrong vision and begin to see what you got. You didn't get this. You didn't get an apple. You got this incredible orange. And as I began to listen to the stories that they told, I realized, oh my goodness, these are tremendous stories that they're telling. And what had happened was, I think in part because my film was so bad, they were willing and trusting to open themselves up, and they told these stories from deep in their heart. And the material is so completely unlike what you would get with a PBS documentary. And that was exactly the thing they did not want to have anything to do with. The PBS crew that would come in with, 15 guys and talking on their walkie-talkies back to headquarters and trying to figure, get them to tell that story, get this one little soundbite, and see if you can do this, that. It was none of that. It was no manipulation. It was just us honestly having fun. And Ed had spent a lot of time on farms in Kansas, and there's something that we felt some similarity between the ethics of farmers and fishermen, and that was part of the discussion that night. On that note, I want to play a couple samples here so you know what we're talking about. This is from, eventually I put this all together into 2 films, a half-an-hour version and then a 1-hour version titled Salt of the Earth, because the climax story that eventually was told was about this phrase, salt of the earth, and these hardworking fishermen. The short version, the half-hour version, played on Maine PBS over and over again over the years. I would run into people and scientists at conferences, and they say, "Oh yeah, I've seen your thing on Maine PBS." And we never even did a deal with them. I just told them, just show it all you want. We love the film. The longer version we showed it a number of events. I don't think we ever even sent it off to film festivals. We did it more for spiritual reasons than we did for any sort of economic model. And let me now play for you two little samples. You're just going to hear the audio. And these are, first one's only a minute, and you'll get a little taste of the humor here. This is Brian talking to Stevie about Stevie had this tradition of shaving his head. And I asked him why he shaved his head, and you can hear Brian's take on it, and then Stevie kind of takes over. So here we go with the first one. Let's see if I can get this to work. And here we go.
He's done that for years. The first, I don't know why he started doing it, why he got it in his head that he wanted to do it. The first time he wanted to, he wanted his wife to do it. She wouldn't. So he calls me up. Brian, get up here. Up to the house. I'm thinking, geez, what have I done? And he's sitting there out on the back porch of the house, sitting there, table in front of him, clippers, scissors, the whole thing. Shave my head. I says, no. Shave my head. Shut up. Shave my head.
I read a thing in the Forbes magazine, a U.S. News. I used to get that.
Grit.
No, not the grit. I said your brain works by oxygen. That's one of the components that makes it work, right?
Sure.
Well, I figure you shave your hair off it. No, I don't know.
So that was just one of the little samples about Stevie shaving his head, and you heard that line about the grit. We'll get Brian to explain that to us. And then here is a longer story, and this one's 5 minutes long, but it's so important because the whole reason that I connected with these guys was out of narrative intuition more than anything else. And we talk a lot about that in my books and in the training and everything else. And narrative intuition is the ability to tell a story that's got a clear arc to it. It's got structure to it. It's got inciting incidents. It's got plant and payoff. It's got all these different characteristics. And there are people that just have a natural ability from that, probably shaped from early on in life. They're out on the boat telling stories to each other. And this is a prime example of it. So this, as I say, is a 5-minute story. So one thing you need to know before listening to this story is this character that he's going to mention in here, Benny Beal, who was one of the most famous lobster fishermen on the coast of Maine. And it's a kind of family name that's been there for generations. And they all knew and loved Benny Beal and looked up to him. And so he's the central character in this story. And also, if you listen closely as he's telling the story, you'll hear some kind of high-pitched sound of ice cubes swizzling in cups, and that was them with their cocktails. These stories were being told. And then the last thing is towards the end, he'll mention the lobster boat races, which is also a long-term tradition. And by the time of this story, Brian had made this transition that he had was no longer a lobster fisherman, in part because of the back injuries that he had, and was now a writer. So here we go.
Sandy and I were married in '83, and things was going pretty good, you know, fishing with Stevie, and I don't know, this was time to get straightened out, getting married. And by fall of that year, boy, we're getting into this big time now, got a baby coming and everything, you know, might as well, everything's going good. And I'd had back trouble off and on for a number of years, but chiropractor would work you back in, you know, so you get back on the boat. Well, it come on that fall, the back trouble come in, and there was nothing left to push back in. Kind of the hinges there on the vertebrae was gone, so they was going to have to do some work. And took quite a while to find a doctor at the time that would even give you a chance to get back on the boat, you know. And that was all at the time that I figured that was all I was going to be able to do, you know. That's all I knew to do at that point was go fishing. So found a doctor that would give me, I didn't want anybody to lie to me, but he told me what had to be done. If I did what he told me, how things might turn out. So that was it. So I was going to have the knife. And that was scary. And then from, thinking that smooth sailing boy, just a matter of a few weeks, really, things looked pretty grim. And no insurance stuff. It just, young, and I meant well, but I was foolish. Didn't make too much provisions for things. Well, the night before I was supposed to go in the hospital, have that work done on my back, Benny, at that point, Benny'd been around us for 5-6 years, yep. Stevie, probably. hadn't seen him that particular year. Probably hadn't seen him for a few months. Probably last time we'd seen him was when we landed in company down to Portsmouth.
Where was he living? Up in Beals Island?
Yeah. And at the time that we were making trips to the Western, and probably last time I seen him, we laid over down to Portsmouth, crew and his crew.
Oh, we won't go into that.
No, move right along. Knock comes on the door. It's evening. Knock comes on the door. Sandy says, "Somebody here to see you." In comes Benny. "Well, hello, Brian." I'm laying there on the day bed. I got the wood stove downstairs in this house we were living in. I'm laying there on my side in the day bed, and I had that corset thing. You remember that? All wrapped up around me in a walking stick. And I felt funny him seeing me like that. I said, get up. He lay right there. Well, he sat down, and he was there for probably a couple hours, and he just kept on talking about the different times over the years, and my God, Lord, man alive, Benny Beals stove himself up enough, and they've put enough parts into him to make 2 or 3 human beings, And he told me quite a few of those stories, and some of them started off pretty grim, and they always ended up all right. And it was because, it's because he kept on trying. Well, by the time that he got ready to leave, and I remember that he made up some story about having to come up the island to check a boat that he had hauled up on the bank over here to Billings Diesel, the big shipyard. First I know, the boat they pushed into the whole swamp pond over there with a backhoe like 2 months before that. The cradle had come up through the bottom of it. I mean, he came up to see me. He didn't want to say it. By the time he got ready to leave, I felt a lot better. Just my courage was up. That's just what I was saying about going down the bay. I was ready to go under the knife, I guess, as much as I was going to be. I felt a lot better. That was worth quite a lot.
Well, there was another thing too.
And he got up, he said, "Well, we're going to be going, Christ, it's snowing, It's snowstorm coming on. He's got like a 2-hour drive, get back down to Beals Island. Got to be going, just wanted to stop by, I was up here, And, I shook his hand. I'm trying to get my corset tightened up there and get up with that stick and follow him out through, just to walk into the door. By the time I shuffled out into the kitchen, Sandy, my wife Sandy's standing in the door. Boy, the water's right there. She's got a hand like that. And Benny's truck down over the driveway, gone. "What ails you?" She opened up a hand. There was a $100 bill in it. When he was going out through the door, he stopped and he said, "Don't you worry now, them Robbins boys are made from tough stock. He's going to be all right." And he just pressed that into her hand, closed the hand out through the door. That was it. He didn't want to talk about it. Well, $100, I had an awful lot of things I could have put that $100 into. Probably just put it into grub, as I remember, and probably a little bit of oil. That was like $1 million, I tell you, at the time. I'll never, ever forget that as long as I live. I told you fellas about the boat races. Of late, he's spared himself enough time to campaign pretty heavily in the lobster boat races up home here. Working at the paper, I've been lucky enough to kind of follow that stuff. And his success and writing about it in the paper is something I've had an awful lot of fun with. And if in any little way I'm paying back my old friend, I hope he wins everything there is to win for 20
Well, he
years.
has.
Yeah, he
What goes
has.
around comes around.
Something else.
Those are a couple of stories that give you an idea of the content that I did the best I could to just glue it together. I did not know how to make a film at that point, but we did get it out to lots of people. And this is where it's interesting and important to talk about something straight out of the ABT framework in our course, which is this fundamental divide in audiences of the inner and outer circle. And if you've done the course or if you looked at the books, this is one of the simple tools we've got, which is there are these 2 fundamental audiences for any sort of communication. There's your inner circle and there's your outer circle. And this film, in editing it, I pretty much edited it for the inner circle. I didn't really care about tourists and strangers, things like that. I wanted to have something that the people of Maine who knew this culture could listen to and appreciate these stories and play them through for their friends and explain them to their friends and say, this is our lifestyle. And as a result, when you listen to especially the 55-minute, the hour-long version of the film, there's parts in there where their accents are so thick I had to listen to the stories 5, 10, 15 times, some of them, until finally I'd hit this one day like, oh, that's what's being talked about here. So lots of not just accent, but terminology from the coast of Maine. but it's one of these things I absolutely love doing, love sharing it with them. I went back up about a month later and showed the first rough cut to Brian and Stevie. And, Stevie's such a big domineering character. I was terrified that he was going to watch this thing, because I had to go back up there and get them to sign a release form to say, yes, it's okay for you to go public with this material. So they pulled the two families together into Stevie's living room that night, and we showed the 55-minute version of it. It was still a little bit rough, but it was just all of these different stories cut together back to back. And when it was over with, Stevie got up and said to Brian, get out here. Two of them walked out onto the patio, and I sat in there for 5 minutes talking with the family members, and they all said, well, it seemed like did a nice job with this, but not knowing what the verdict was going to be. And then finally the sliding glass door opens up and Stevie leans in and says, you get out here. And I walked out there wondering if this was going to be the bad news. And I remember Stevie saying, I don't know who you are, I don't know who sent you up here, but the way you captured those stories with us is exactly our whole lifestyle, and the way you put them together intact, without putting them into some short attention span version, but just there for the audience that has a longer attention, that's the inner circle that's really interested in this. And he said, give us those forms, we'll sign them. As far as we're concerned, you've got our trust, you do whatever you want with it. 20 years later, in 2011, we staged a whole event at the University of Maine. I was invited there for my communication stuff. And I said to them, there's no way I'm coming to the University of Maine unless we show this film for an audience. And we did that. We put together a wonderful evening that Ed came there with me, and the two brothers were there, and all their friends, and Maine Sea Grant folks at University of Maine sponsored it. And we put on a big show in their big auditorium, a couple hundred people there. And the two brothers, Brian and Stevie, are both great guitar players and singers, and they've had bands over the years. Brian will talk a little bit about that. And so we put on a whole show. And in addition to that, a whole separate storyline that Eddie, in his film production work, had gotten to know John McEwen, one of the co-founders of the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band from the 1960s. And John's a brilliant guitar and banjo and fiddle player, and happened to be in Maine for that same time. So we talked him into coming over that night, and the three of them put on a tremendous show. And we've got the link along with the materials here for this episode, and you can click on that. I think it's saltthemovie.org. And on there, we posted both versions of the film, as well as some clips from that night at University of Maine, that wonderful event that we threw there. And there's lots more that can be said, but at that point, why don't we have both Brian Robbins coming to us from the coast of Maine, and Ed Leydecker joining us again. And I will stop sharing on that note, and we're going to turn this into a little conversation at this point. And here we go. Hello, Brian. How are you today?
Well, I'm pretty good, Doc. How are you?
I am great. Did I get anything wrong there in my lengthy setup for the whole backstory?
Well, I have a list here.
Here we go.
And it's funny because somebody was just asking me this the other day about my surgery, my fusion I had. That was 1983. And I'm like, I should be a poster child for spinal fusion. And I was back on the boat. That was the end of October, 1983. April Fool's Day, 1984. I'm on the deck, back aboard the boat, making my first trip, stacking those 4-foot wooden traps we used to fish back then, seven rows high, And I fished for another 3 years, I think, after that, before I came ashore.
And that's amazing. All right, we have to start our discussion here with your brother. So your older brother, Stevie Robbins, larger than life, passed away last year at age 76. And then this past August, you did a year later a tribute event to him where you pulled together all the local musicians. And start telling us about Stevie.
Ever since I was old enough to know that I had a brother, he was my hero, And it's funny because people that knew Stevie then, so Stevie was 14 years older than me. He's a 14-year-old boy with a brand new baby brother. There was just the two of us. And people have told me over the years, they used to tell me, and they still do, about how this 14-year-old fisherman, young fisherman basketball player he was, would walk around with his little baby brother in a stroller, and pretty proud of it, And our father, Steve Sr., Pa, when we're telling the stories, you're talking about Pa, that was our father. Pa was, he and Mom, my mother, they were older when they had us. And when I really got old enough to start working, I played around when Pa was working when I was little. But when I got old enough to start working, it was with my brother. And so not only was Stevie just his push and his humor and all that, but I learned how to work from my brother. Last night, my wife and I, Felicity, are at the local Hannaford, and we're in the checkout line. We've got our cart full of groceries. And I catch myself, just for a moment, leaning one arm on the cart as I pick something out of it. And I can hear my brother from when I was just a little kid. You land you're hauling lobster traps. You land one on the rail and you flip the door open and you start taking the lobsters out. And as a little kid, the first time that I ever leaned one arm, on the trap and reached in, brother just stops the trap haul and looks at me and says, "If you're that tired, go down below and lay down." It was use both hands if you're going to do something. So to this day, I can still hear him saying that, So that lessons never left me.
Well, and I headed off to film school 27 years ago, and that film was already in my background. And when you edit films, you get these lines stuck in your head because you have to edit them over and over and over again. They just get drilled down deep in your head. And there's so many lines from that film that not only were amusement, but they were inspiration to me, just some of the things. And I don't know, I don't know why they stick in your head, Brian, get up here. Just the tone of that line. There were a number of people that know you that when they saw that film, that line hit them like, that sounds just like Stevie. Brian, get up here. Shave my head.
Shave my head. Yeah. If I was going to try to describe my brother to somebody that had never met him, I don't know where we were, maybe down to a Atlantic offshore lobstermen's association thing down in Rhode Island or somewhere. We were traveling somewhere. One of the few times we left the island by land, rather than boat. And wherever we were, I think we were having a meal, maybe a couple cocktails, but I'm not sure. Older building we're in, there's 3 or 4 other fellows with us at a table, and somebody's looking around. One of the guys looking around, they said, "Man, this is an old building. Geez, just that one door. God, if there was ever a fire, we'd never get out of here." And Stevie looked at him, and where our table was right up against this old brick wall. Stevie looked at that wall. He kind of shrugged, and the other fellow said something again about, well, guess we'd have to make a run for the door, something happened. Finally, Stevie said, "Well, if you're all worried about it, you could get out through this wall." He taps those bricks, Stevie says, "You get out through that wall if you wanted to." And that guy started laughing. Everybody at the table started laughing. Stevie wasn't laughing. He says, he just waited, and they kind of quieted down. He looked that guy in the eye. He says, "You're telling me that if that was the only way out of here, you don't think that you could get out through that brick wall?" And the guy he didn't know what to say. And I don't know if anybody else at that table thought that they could get out through that brick wall, they would not have bet against my brother getting out through that brick wall. That's the deal. And Stevie believed that he could. You know, that's the way it was. We'd be offshore, and your trap trawls would have end poles on either end, north and south end, radar reflectors, and oftentimes after a storm they'd be gone, you know. And so you're trying to see the balloons that are left, you know, spot them by eye. And I can still hear it. Stevie, you know, we'd all be looking, the crew would be looking, scanning the horizon. And Stevie'd say, let Bry up there, let Bry up on the bow, he'll find it. And because it won't make any sense, Randy, but maybe you want to cut this out after. Because my brother said that I could, I did.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. No, that's amazing. Tell me about, you guys crossed paths with Bob Brown and the whole fishing boat that was behind Perfect Storm and that whole story, right?
Well, I never saw, and I don't know if Stevie did, the Andrea Gale, the Hannah Bowden. That was, let me see, I'll back it up. Back in 1977, when the first boat that we went offshore in was a 44-foot Stanley built. The hull was built by Geoff Williams' yard down in Southwest Harbor, Somme Sound on Mount Desert Island. And it was, the boat was finished by Brooklyn Boatyard, Joel White, who was a great man. Part of the inspiration, there were probably two people that were the main inspirations for Stevie thinking about going offshore lobstering to begin with. One of them being Benny Beal, who you mentioned in the intro, down on Beals Island. Benny and his father and his grandfather, I think, built like a wooden 45-footer in the backyard and launched it, and he takes off to the continental shelf with nothing to go by except some stories that they'd heard that there was some lobsters there, you know. And you ask him years later, you say, Benny, what made you do that then? And he just, oh, I don't know, dear. I guess I just thought it was time to go, you know. The other person was Bob Brown from Massachusetts. Suicide Brown. The name that we'd heard at that point, just a fearless driver, but it was more than that. He was smart too. And so here are these guys that are heroes to you. Well, as time went on, one way or another, first getting the crossing paths with Benny, and then Bob Brown bought a house up on Deer Isle. So it ends up that just, you know, the organic nature of things, he ends up crossing paths with Stevie. And so these fellows that were both heroes became really close friends. And Bob Brown was around during those opening years of, first it was just the two of us going offshore, like to starve to death, looking for lobsters, you know, off in the Gulf of Maine, and, you know, trying bottom that nobody had. Were you
on some of those trips to the way out there on the Outer Banks and the high seas?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. No, that was, like I say, the two of us. It was just the two of us in the beginning. We finally ended up on Cash's Ledge and added another man. And yeah, by the end of 78, going into 79, we were down into, if you look on a chart of the Gulf of Maine, we were down in the Kroll Basin. So we were fishing at that point 180 miles out of Stonington.
Wow.
The boat cruise. 10 knots. So it took you 18 hours to get to the gear, you know. So you'd have to leave on a northwest gale, hoping that it would be flattening out by the time you get out there. But those first few years, Bob Brown, you mentioned Brown. Brown was around, and he'd watch you, and he wouldn't say anything. Well, he'd say something sarcastic, but after a while, he kept giving these little hints about things. And so, like with fishing gear, the first traps that we had that we went offshore with were half rounds that we built ourselves. It was Bob Brown. I remember the conversation with my brother. Bob's down to the old shop where you made the movie, and he's looking at the traps that we were building, shakes his head, and he looks at my brother and he says, "Robbins, have you ever heard of Anderson trap?" And Stevie says, "No, Brown, I haven't heard of Anderson trap." He said, "Well, have you seen any advertisements for Anderson trap?" And Stevie grabs, a copy of the fishing paper and flips through it madly, and throws it down. He said, "No, Brown, there's no advertisements for Anderson trap." And Bob says, "Well, that's because they don't have to, Robbins. They're booked out several years ahead." The first load of Anderson traps that we ever had to try was actually one of Bob Brown's truckload orders that he gave us his spot in line so we could get a load of these traps to try. And that changed everything. They were at the time, that was what you wanted if you were going to be doing that. And it's funny, years later, telling Hugh Bishop, I've got to know Hugh Bishop down the Marblehead, Mass. And I think a lot of him. He's a good friend. And Hugh was a childhood buddy of Bob's, and Hugh put his time in offshore as well. He's quite a character. And I said something to Hugh about, getting to know Bob early on and how much he helped us. And Hugh looked at me puzzled. He said, "Bob would tell you stuff?" I said, Yeah, he helped us a lot." He said, "Bob Brown." I says, "Yeah." He said, "God, Brownie," he always called me. He said, "Brownie he'd never tell anybody anything. He was the first guy down that he was telling me, Bob was the first guy down here to have an autopilot. And everybody else was kind of watching to see how he liked having this autopilot on the boat running way off there. And the first couple years, anybody would ask Bob about it, he'd say, "Oh, God, it's the biggest waste of money. I wouldn't have another one aboard the boat," because he didn't want anybody else to have it.
Yeah. Did you hit some treacherous times out there in the way out in the outer regions?
Yeah, that was weather. We had the two things I guess I'd say about that. Well, three things. First,
you ever hit any storms that were like you afraid for your life in storms?
Yeah. I was going to say, anybody that, and Stevie would tell you the same thing. Anybody that told you he's never scared is either lying or just foolish,
Right.
But we had the two boats that we fished offshore, and down Kroll Basin, Georges Basin, up on the Georges itself. That 44-foot Stanley was a tiny boat to be out there in, but what a sea boat. And then the boat that you guys got to know, the Stacy V, the steel boat, she was 54 feet. That was like a ship to us, but still probably the smallest offshore boat that was out there, but just an incredible sea boat. So both of those boats were something else. But really, here's my brother. Man, my brother was just, you just knew if there was, whatever the percentage was, if it was 1% of a chance that you were going to get through something, Stevie'd be the one to pull you through, When my son was 10 years old, he fished one summer offshore with my brother. And I think that there were probably people that got talking to me about it, probably would have called, the Department of Human Services or something, let us go out there like that. I never gave it a thought. I mean, it was just because it was Stevie. And it was, but yeah, so there was weather, but a lot of that stuff, well, you don't hang on to it. If you carried all that stuff around, you'd never go back,
Yeah,
So,
yeah. When did you guys get started playing music?
I was a little kid. Stevie played the guitar. And back then was when, you folded up a dollar bill, or maybe it was like 2 quarters, taped them together inside of a envelope, wrapped it up in paper and sent it to a publishing house in New York City. And that'd be the manila envelope would come back with a Johnny Cash songbook, right? And so it's not like downloading, the chords off the computer now. So there'd be the songbook there, and there's like, 10 pages to get through I Walk the Line or something, My job was to sit alongside of Stevie on the bed. And when he got to that certain point in the song, flip the page. So I had to be paying attention. And, he'd let me know it if I missed my cue. So, I had to be focused on what he was doing. So that's how that started, was turning the pages with my brother.
And how'd the event go back in August? You got together the old the band, and tell us about what evolved with Sunday mornings in the shop and music jam sessions.
Yeah, well, Stevie and I, the fishing years, whenever we would just whenever it came a chance, I think for a little while there, I kept the guitar on the boat. And but there was one thing that we would do back in the, I don't know when it started, late 70s, early 80s. There was a bunch of us most of us were fishing at the time. If we were home on the 3rd of July in the evening, we'd get together and basically stay up all night working up, seriously working up a few songs for the parade the next day, the 4th of July parade. And then on the 4th, they'd load us onto a flatbed trailer, and we'd drive through through town with this bunch of fellows and play our tunes. And if nobody fell off the float, then it was considered a success. And every year we would always make up a name for the band based on whatever the theme of the parade was that year. So I remember one year was the Summer Olympics, and Stevie came up with the name of the band that year. And I can see the poster in Stevie's handwriting, those big block letters with a magic marker about that thick. Jacques Strap. So JACQUESSTRAPP, Jacques Strap and the Sweat Band, in honor of the Olympics. And one year, 1989, was the year that they were voting on the 5-cent returnables. The referendum was to have a 5-cent deposit on bottles, and they called it the bottle bill. And that year for the parade, we were Bottle Bill and the Returnables. So that was 1989, and we actually, for whatever reason, we got asked to keep on playing after that. So we had a bunch of gigs through that summer and fall with the Returnables, and we're the only band. The old Legion Hall on Deer Isle, where we live, to my knowledge, now there might have been a band that blew one of the old fuses, the old screw-in type fuses. But I think we're the only band that ever blew 2 fuses in the same night. on the same song even. That was back when, of course, everybody smoked. So my brother's up there on the bandstand, 300 and some odd pounds of him, cigar, hat, Ray-Bans, banging on that old Martin guitar. And I think the song was Janis Joplin's Piece of My Heart. And every time we get to the chorus, come on, take it, and pow. And the Legion Hall would just go down.
The fuse would blow.
Yeah, and the first time it happened, somebody gets down underneath there and they got a flashlight and say, "Trace, man, blown a fuse here for years." And they start off. We start up the same song again, and we get to the come on, and take it, and pow. So then they threatened us. They said, "Look, we got one fuse left. You idiots can't scream." What was your connection with was it Levon Helm and the band, and you used to go to his events upstate New York? What was all that? Oh no, my wife and I, Tigger and I, Felicity, got to go. We went twice to Levon's Rambles, midnight rambles he had on Sunday nights. And my God, man, that was, it was 3 or 4 years maybe before, I guess the last time we were there before Levon passed away. He sometimes he'd look frail, but in the course of one song, he'd go from looking frail to looking like he owned the world, And but one of the greatest moments I remember.
What was the event? It was in his barn?
Yeah. And he would just have these Saturday night get-togethers, and have some great musicians come in. He had kind of a house band, but he would have special guests come in. But one of the best memories I have of that didn't even involve Levon on stage. He'd actually just played, they played Atlantic City, the old Bruce Springsteen song, which once Levon played it, he owned it. But Levon had that mandolin. He was holding it, and he walked off from the stage area, and he was over in the shadows. And his daughter Amy and a couple other women, I can't remember who, doesn't matter. I can't remember who the other women were, but they were harmonizing. And Larry Campbell, the fiddle player, was just playing these long, slow drone notes on the fiddle, and these women, these beautiful voices. And where Felicity and I were sitting, we could see Levon over there in the shadows. He wasn't doing it for anybody to see. He was holding that mandolin like a little baby with his eyes closed. And oh God, man, yeah, something else.
So tell us about the bizarre encounter you had from the very beginning with Eddie and me showing up there, wanting to meet your brother, and you telling us he's out of town.
I don't think, you've used that line about him being out of town. I think that I would have told you that he was out on a trip, and you guys thought it was like, he packed a suitcase or something, rather than, just as we used to we used to call it offshore Samsonite, which was a garbage bag full of clothes and leaving on a trip. But,
why were you so suspicious of outside film crews wanting to come in there?
Well, what little bit that there had ever been done about our world, you come out of it saying, like, man, I wonder what, because like for us, it'd be like all the Westerns that we'd seen growing up. And you say, wow, I wonder what the real cowboys thought of all those movies, because it seemed like anything that had ever been done about our world, it was with somebody's preconceived notion of what it was supposed to be and how you talked and how you acted. And it by virtue of them laying so much of themselves onto the situation, nothing could be the way that it was supposed to be. So
Yeah.
that
Well, let me interject something on that, because this starts to get into story structure and the stuff that this podcast is about, which is after we put the film together, and there were two versions. There's a half-hour version and then the hour version, and both of them were the same basic stories. That just the hour version had a lot of stuff that you kind of need to really love down East Maine and understand the accent. And if you were looking for something, you're outside tourist and you get mad at not understanding every word, then that was not the right film to watch. But for the people,
what is this accent?
Yeah, what exactly. And so as we began screening those two things for different groups and gathering experiences with them, one of the things that we saw, both of them climax with the same story, which is a great story that Stevie finally tells about the tourist boat that he pulled up to when he was a kid, and he had some lobsters to sell to the guys in the back deck. And the one guy asked to buy all the lobsters that he had. And then the guy on the boat said, what do you want to charge me for them? And he said, well, you just judge, he left it up to Stevie and the fisherman, said, you just tell us what you think they're worth, no haggling. And then he turned to the people on the boat and said, these lobster fishermen, they're the salt of the earth. And that's the little phrase that we use for the title of the whole film. And it's that emotional moment of being trusted by people like that from the outside world and that reputation that they had. And then he goes on from there and saying, unfortunately, things are changing nowadays with the cultural change. And that's what's really powerful in the film. And it's so powerful that as he tells that part, there's a little tear going down, side of his cheek. And it's that crying moment that hits people right in their heart. And it's so built up. And so the first thing that we saw was that people who watched the half-hour version, when they got to that final story, they felt a little something. People who watched the hour version cried. And that was really profound and deep and important. That's narrative structure right there at work, which is you can't in a short period of time get people to a really deep place narratively. It takes time. You've got to invest in, you got to get to know these characters and pay your dues. And if you're willing to do that and get deep with them, then you can really feel something if you trust the storytellers and the filmmakers. And that's what we got with the hour version. And all the TV people, people don't have long enough attention span to watch a whole hour's worth. So they never got the treat of that. But we had screenings where we did have a captive audience that watched the whole thing, and they felt it at the end, the 55 minutes, the big payoff there, which is really wonderful. And then one of the rotten experiences that I ended up having was I was trying to figure out how to get an audience for the thing. And we did finally find that half-hour version on Maine PBS played a lot. But PBS in Minnesota station, I think it was, had some national thing that they announced and, send us your footage and things like that. And they were wanting to put together like highlights of great documentaries. And I sent them the film, and then they wrote back and said, oh God, we love your film. And will you sell us those 3 minutes of the lobster fisherman crying? And, kind of like the old, the Indian crying for the keep America clean type of thing. And I ended up on the phone with them. I said, what are you talking about? And they said, oh, well, we've got all these different scenes and we want to have this moment from, New England. And here's a fisherman telling a story where he ends up so choked up. Yeah, but that's out of context. If you don't give us the build up to it, to get to know these people, their whole life and everything like that, to understand, it's the definition of melodrama. This is the very thing I talk about in our course nowadays. The definition of melodrama is unmotivated drama. And that's what you get in soap operas. They don't do the background work to really get you the deep feeling. And that's the difference between a great movie. The climax scenes in some of the greatest of movies is all this emotion, and you pull it out of there and it looks really hammy and way over the top, but you embed it inside of a journey that took you an hour and a half to get there. Then you totally understand it. And that was a big learning experience for me. I mean, that's why this film is so meaningful to me at this stage in my life, as I'm writing books about narrative structure and running this whole course and training things like that. And I never bothered to try and get a national audience for the film, but that, among many things, taught me something about the difference between the shallow half-hour version and the deeper hour version. This is how you get people to feel things. And this is why a short attention span world ends up losing part of our spectrum of emotions. You just can't feel this deep stuff. And this gets into very deep topics of today's world, in which through the information explosion and everybody leading these fast-paced lives, people aren't getting to the depth emotionally. I think both in humor and emotion. I don't think that humor is quite as deep as it used to be in some of the stuff, and definitely emotion. You just can't do it on a short attention span. What are your thoughts on that, Dr. Robbins?
Well, I tell you what, that was you want to take it to heart, and you still want to take it to heart, that, in that moment, when that tear starts down Stevie's cheek, I remember he wiped at it and he says softly, turn that camera off.
That's right.
And you didn't.
That's right.
And, I don't know how you knew that it was okay to leave it in there. You took a chance because, somebody else, when you showed us
That's right.
first cut there at the house, you might not have gotten a chance to redo it. Might have said, I told you to turn that camera off. But you guys had you guys had us. I mean, you had our trust. Yeah. And I don't know how we knew by then. Didn't seem like
well, you hit on the key word there. I think that's why that and for Ed as well, why it was such an interesting and gratifying experience, the whole deal with you guys. The key word is trust. And Ed and I were just talking a few hours ago I was telling him about a friend of mine who was a producer on a reality show that went in and meddled with people's lives and got their trust, and then just walked away from some of them. And they presented, I don't even want to name the show or anything like that, but it was a major show, and he was a producer on it, and it went for 4 seasons. And then I had lunch with him right after they pulled the plug on the 5th season. And he had said he just came from the production office. He said, oh my God, they just disbanded this thing overnight. And he said, I feel really bad. I went into the production office and I hit the button on the phone machine, and there's all these families we've been working with who trust us. And they're saying, we need your help. We want to talk to you about our sons, considering suicide, things like that. And like, they all just ended the company and walked away from it all. And, talk about violating trust. And that's what happens. That's what happens in this media production world. People get going so fast and they don't really care about the subjects that they've got. And you get that endlessly with the reality stuff. And all right, now it's time for Ed to weigh in on that topic. I mean, you must have dealt with that in your 25, 30 years now being a film producer, Ed.
It's fun seeing Brian again, because I haven't seen him for so long. It's been a few years, and just sitting back listening to you guys, you touch my heart again. And, having been there at that moment with Stevie, the lead up to that was pretty frightening. We were afraid of that man. That was one of the biggest men I've ever been around in my life. And I'm going to go back a little bit because I know there was that point when we were trying to get Stevie to participate. And I know I was staying with Randy when he was working at University of New Hampshire. And I was there for a few months with Randy, and Randy got me into seeing if I could go convince Stevie to be interviewed. And it was during that time frame where his boat was coming into Portsmouth. Randy and I talked about it, and we didn't really know how to approach this giant of a man. And so I went out and picked up a couple dozen donuts at the favorite donut shop there in Portsmouth, and sat on the dock. As I think, if I remember correctly, I got there around 4 o'clock in the morning.
Exactly, 4 a.m.
And I'm sure Randy and I and the boys had a few cocktails before I made that venture over there to build up my my feelings that I could pull this off with this guy. And I went over there. I had no idea. I thought he was going to throw me in the water. So I see this big boat coming in, and having been at that point a Kansas, just Midwestern guy, I'd never really seen a boat quite like that. And I know it's small to you, Brian, but it felt like it was, it was bigger than life. Except when it came into the harbor, the silhouette of the man that was on the boat was bigger than the boat. And I had never seen, an offshore lobster boat coming in with all these major lights and it was like a parade. They were coming into the harbor, and I could hear this guy's voice from a very long distance. I'm going, oh my God, don't tell me this is the lion that's coming and I'm going to try to tame this guy. So anyway, I just hung my feet off the edge of the dock. I didn't say a word. I watched the way he barked out commands to the crew with great respect, but very, very authoritative and very professional, to that point that you just listen to Stevie and you do what he says, and we'll get this lobster load unloaded there in Portsmouth. So I let him tie up to the dock. I sat there for a few moments. I didn't want to interrupt him. I waited for that perfect moment when I thought he had all of his instructions given at that point. And I stood there and I go, Mr. Robbins. And he turns over and looks at me and just stared at me, and had the cigar, of course, and just stared. He goes, well, and he stared at me, didn't say a word. And I go, I'm here. I'm working with Randy Olson, the marine biologist that would like to interview you. And he stood there for a few moments. No, yes, no. Oh, let's do this. Didn't say a word. So as he came over to me, I didn't know if he was going to throw me off the edge of the dock, or I instantly stuck the two big boxes of donuts in his hand. And I said, I brought you a little something, Stevie. And, back in the Midwest, I felt it was appropriate to bring you guys a little something that you could have this morning for your successful fishing trip. And he just sat there and smiled. And, it was never hard pressure. It was never, we're going to make this documentary. We didn't say anything, it was more of he and I bonding. And I at that moment, not only was I deathly afraid of him, I felt that this man was pretty special. And I was going to, if it even meant I had to get on the boat and clean the damn boat and help him, I was going to do whatever it took. And through my patience, I think at that point, and what it taught me through the last 30 years of my life being in the film business was, be honest. And we were never trying to make your family be something they weren't. It was something that we had already felt at this point, just knowing the buildup to this whole piece of what it could be. And it was pretty special, and it had an incredible impact on my life and the types of projects that I currently work on. It's like I mentioned to Randy about the reality show he mentioned to me today. I personally can't do that kind of work. I can't be involved in the exploitation of people. And, we have taken a pretty solid lead in the documentary world and all through different eras of history. And I think a lot of that feeling, and my business partner, Shane, is, not only my business partner, but one of my best friends in my life. And he respects history the way I have learned to respect it with him through my experience with people like you, Brian, and your family and your dad and Stevie. And it was an unreal world to me, because I didn't go to school to study filmmaking. But Randy created that love at the very beginning of, what I found to be a very exciting profession. And, it impacted my life meeting Stevie. And I think the interview that we had from him, I think that, me taking the time to show up there, spend 2 hours with him, waiting for him to unload the lobster boats until he jumped down and sat next to me and we had a conversation. And it was taking the time that I think was so valuable and educational for me. But, you guys have impacted my life, and it shows that, compassion, understanding of people, it's a wonderful experience, and it's embedded in my whole life.
Well, and I'll add something at this point. First off, that I'm an extremely smart guy, and I'm very charismatic, and people all love me. And yet, but we've got to turn here. And yet, I do have enough common sense to know to team up with someone like Ed, who's got these people skills and charisma. And you never would have done that evening of interview with just me alone. It was Ed's. The credit I gave him on the film was cultural liaison. And that was the deal, was that his years working out in farms in Western Kansas, things like that, he had the chemistry to connect with you guys. And that was a pivotal moment that night. I remember he came back that morning. Of course, I didn't even wake up. I should have gone down there with him at 4 a.m. I said, what the hell? And Ed was the guy who
want to get his ass kicked.
That's right. Exactly. I'm not going down there to get my ass kicked from that big fisherman. And Ed was the guy that had the sensibility. And I wouldn't think to go get a bunch of donuts. I'd show up at the boat and say, hey, Stevie, where's your donuts? I'm hungry. And so Ed's got that sensibility and people skills that really was crucial in that and a number of other projects. And what's just popped into my mind, this is a horrible contrast to mention, but I got to say this right now. Years later, I end up out here working with the ocean conservation community and all of these kind of preppy driven, heavily funded, well-intended, non-governmental organizations that are out to save nature from the rotten fishermen that are destroying the coast. And in 2005, there was a big issue going on here on the California coast, which was marine protected areas where the state was blocking off chunks of the coast to stop fishing to help the fisheries replenish. And the environmental groups were working with them to try and do the communications. And they just blundered over and over again and offended the fishing community. And I witnessed that stuff after having done Salt of the Earth with you guys and getting a little bit of insight into the fishing community, and as Stevie said, we don't want to ruin the resource there. We're not anti-environmentalists. We're trying to harvest this stuff. And one of the things that happened on the central coast of California was, a long story. I made this humorous public service announcement that aired on the TV channels up and down the California coast that was having a little bit of fun with the issue of overfishing. And the fishermen got upset about that. And then I went up there with my film crew and sat down with them for an evening, a similar sort of thing, almost like I'd learned from our experience with Salt of the Earth. And I said to those guys, look, you're upset with what I did with this thing. Let me make a video with you and let you guys present your side of it. We did that. And we sat there that night and we called it the Tiny Fish Reply. And he pulled together 5 of their best fishermen and they told stories of what they had been through. And one of the stories they told about was that was a fishing port there. And one morning the guy's driving into work and he looks up at this great big billboard that was just newly erected. And on there is a picture of clear cutting of a forest and a headline that said, "This is what fishermen are doing to our oceans." And it was from NRDC, Natural Resource Defense Council. They, with all their lawyers and all their big money, came tromping into this seaside community and decided it's time to message to the community that fishermen are ruining the oceans. And, the complete disconnect in cultural sensitivity, I couldn't believe that they would do something like that. And that's what the fishermen were saying to me that night at that dinner, afterwards when we did our discussion with them. And they said, imagine what it's like showing up for work and you look up and here's this assault from the media world vilifying you, saying you are the villains here in the oceans. And no wonder there was just so much tension going on over this marine protected area thing where they were at loggerheads and they were having big meetings where the fishermen were turning out hundreds of people in black t-shirts just saying, stop this idiocy of blocking off the coast from our fishing practices. We're not destroying it. And the environmental groups were working with the scientists, but their communication style and skills were so bad. And what they were missing, basically, I'm trying to say, is what Ed played that role of someone who can understand the community and help with the communications, bridge the gap between the heavily educated academics that have no real world practical experience and then the well-intended working class folks that are out there trying to make a living off the resource. And it's a big cultural divide. And that's exactly what I think went on there. And take it away, Brian.
I don't think we ever would have made it as a reality TV show. This week on the Stacey V, Stevie points out that Brian's just healing tattoo that he got in Portsmouth is misspelled. Snyder wonders if 3 cartons of Viceroys will be enough for the trip.
And Sterno provides his recipe for.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing. I can't remember. Did the fried egg story make both versions of the movie?
Of course it did. Some stories can't be tampered with. So yeah, how would you fry eggs if you did not fry them?
Yeah, well, we'll let folks watch the movie to figure all that out. Yeah, well, it comes back to what I said before about the reason why we agreed to sit down with you guys to begin with was just what little bit that we got from you, both of you, prior to, yeah, comes back to that same word, trust. We knew that you weren't trying to get us to fit your preconceived notions of what Fisherman was supposed to be. You wanted to find out about our world. And
Yeah.
I've said this, I just soon go on record right now saying it. I've told you before and told a lot of people in the last 30 years, if nobody had ever seen that movie outside of our family, it would be okay. Because in the beginning, you know, that was 1981, excuse me, 1991.
91. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. 1995, Pa passed away. Just to have, you know, the three of us sitting there talking, and Stevie and I both said afterwards, I remember Steve saying, Christ, I wish we'd shut up and let Pa talk more, you know. But just to have him captured on film, and even though to us, we did wish that he told more stories, but what you got of him, you
Was
let
great.
him be. You let
Yeah.
him be. You let him be him. And that, again, Pa
I
was
know.
somebody that, you know.
Yeah, well, he had that classic kind of dry humor, and the one story he tells about, I wrote on the side of my trap, if you haul this trap, you'll get shot. Somebody else came along and wrote bang.
Bang. Yeah. So to have that is priceless. And then of course now,
Yeah.
you know,
Well, it gets very, very deep because it starts to get at the core of what is the truth, what are you interested in? You know, all these filmmakers, I want to get out there and capture the truth in reality. Yeah, but you kind of trample over these people along the way, and you end up in the business world, you know, demands this, and it's all driven by short attention span people. And at some point, where's your spirituality? Where do you really care about? Who do you care about? You know, if you're using these people day in and day out to try and plug them into your thing to just try and generate a lot of revenues, I don't know. That's too bad. And I think that when we went and did that thing, for me, I've always been at this interface between the real world and reality. I've always cared about what's going on in the real world. The research that I did as a marine biologist, I was always doing field work and pointing out how these people who sit in their laboratories trying to study these creatures, that they create artificial things in the labs. And why don't they just go out there into the water and look at it? And that's why you end up with great respect if you have that mindset, respect for fishermen, because fishermen are the guys who are out there day in and day out, and they actually see the environment. And that's just the saddest thing imaginable, is when you get scientists coming along trying to tell fishermen this is how it works, and the fishermen are saying, I'm sorry, but I'm out there on a daily basis, and your models are great, but sometimes your models are really wrong because you're just not ground truth by the real world out there. I'm guessing you've had a little experience with that in the world of lobster fishing at times.
You'd go to the meetings years ago, and you know, that whole thing about lobstering offshore out of Maine back in the late 70s, we were kind of I guess kind of black sheep in some circles, because you know, people thought that all the brood stock was coming from off there, and we were going to you know, do in the inshore lobster fishery by what we were doing. And you'd go to meetings and you could get up and say what you'd seen, but that didn't carry as much clout as the folks with the ties and the nice jackets sitting at the table, who could make a you know, a very impressive presentation about what they thought. So it's what they thought versus what we'd seen. And
Yeah.
for whatever reason, we didn't carry the clout. We used to say, listen, come out with us. We've got plenty of bunks. We don't use them that much. You know, you've got a place to lay down. You can see this for yourself. And yeah, it was frustrating. And
I, you know, as I enter the next stretch of my work, and trying to make some more films and things like that. The theme that I've gotten increasingly consumed with as a single word is arrogance. And arrogance is a terrible thing, and it brings with it a huge price, and it destroys social dynamics. And you see this a lot at times. There are certain parts of society that are arrogant, and that's what I've battled with the academic world. And a lot of people hate me for that. But my first book, Don't Be Such a Scientist, was exactly about that. I learned in acting class. We got to do exercises in these acting classes in Hollywood where you got to see, here's what happens to your audience when you have a character act arrogant versus sympathetic. And sympathetic is coming down low and trying to make sense and ask questions. Why are you doing this? What's going on? Arrogant is rising above and talking down to them. You people are stupid. Don't you understand? We've got all the data here. We know what we're talking about. Blah, 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 blah. And it's watching that dynamic on a daily basis. And in fact, Ed, who over the years, over and over again, came and visited me in different places, in particular Lizard Island in Australia. He came and spent several weeks there, and he watched some of the scientists and the way that they behaved. And Ed's background was in personnel director originally. When he graduated from college, he got a job at one of the suburbs of Kansas City as personnel director for a city. And that's because of his great people skills. And this is what the science world has always lacked, is people skills. They don't understand social dynamics. A lot of them hate my book, Don't Be Such a Scientist, because I talked about it verbatim in there. And, science is great, but if you don't have the cultural sensitivity to know how to implement it, and that's exactly what and this goes on, because that's what the pandemic has been the past year and a half, this problem of the anti-vaccination crowd. So much of that has been the science crowd just talking down to them. You stupid people, why aren't you doing this? It ain't that simple. It's just lecturing them, telling them they're stupid. There's a lot of elements of chemistry. And what the science world really needs to do is to partner with people like Ed, who they can provide that bridge. They've got the sensitivity and understanding of cultures that the science world, it's hard to do both, to be a scientist and cram all this information in your head and somehow suddenly be this really listening, sensitive person. That's what Hollywood taught me. That's in all my books, is that when you pack a lot of information in your head, your ears shut down. It's just not physiologically possible to do both. And you need to partner with the people who can do that. And you see it happen sometimes, and it really works well when it does. I think that, well, we don't want to get into the specifics, but, we know outreach organizations and things like that try and work with the fisheries community, and they do some good stuff. Their intentions are good. They're at least a bridge that's meant to be there from the pure information academic world to these outreach groups, and then to the community that's actually doing the work. But you've had years of watching that dynamic, and I don't know that we need to get into stories, because you've shared some of the frustrations with me over the years. Right, Brian?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe. Ay. Tell us a few more tales about Stevie, and what was the best part of those Sunday mornings once it got going. And you told me eventually it got a bit diluted down with everybody bringing the tourists and turning it into a spectacle, but it must have had a good stretch in the beginning of going to church with Stevie on Sunday mornings, and the jam sessions that you would have in his shop. Tell us a little bit about that.
Oh yeah, no, it evolved from, me being, because I moved off the island, and where we live now, couple hours to get up to Deer Isle. So I talk with Stevie during the week and say, think we'll be up this weekend. Good, bring your guitar. And we'd be down the shop early on a Sunday morning, and the other fishermen that would be around to talk and drink coffee and tell stories would be there. And at some point we'd haul out the guitars and have a song or two, and then one of the other fellows, good buddy Eric Beckman from over to Vinyl Haven, started coming over with his bass, and eventually another guy would show up with a guitar, and another one, and it just kept growing, and it got to the point where there were people, I'd say to Stevie, and I remember being in there and being way up in the back corner there in the shop with my guitar, and it'd be like, 15 or 18 people playing musical instruments of all different kinds, and another 20 people crammed into the shop watching them, and I'd say,
and was Stevie kind of the conductor usually?
Oh, he was, right in the
course.
middle of it. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, of course.
And my brother had a way. I mean, he should have been on a throne or something, but Stevie actually, his spot there in the shop was, we're in the dark part of the country here. Hang on a second.
Oh, yeah, I was going to ask if you might want to turn on a light at some point.
Yeah.
And we're going to go about another 15 minutes or so, but keep on going.
Well, we should. But Stevie he had a little stool that he would sit on in the floor of the shop. So if he wasn't as big of a man as he was, you never would have saw him, But and I'd say to Stevie, now, who was that playing the the mandolin? I don't know. I never saw him before in my life, And I wouldn't be up there every week. I wouldn't be up there for weeks at a time. It eventually became this own thing. And I was like, the outsider that would show up, after a while. It did kind of get to the point. I don't know. It went on for 4 or 5 years, 5, 6 years. I don't know how long it went on.
That's amazing.
Finally, yeah. And Stevie finally said he just had to kind of reclaim the shop so he could work on gear and stuff. And that was just before he got sick. I did want to say, I know I probably said the same phrase 2 or 3 times during this conversation. If I was going to tell one story about my brother, but
yeah.
Let me tell you one, if we have time, about.
Yeah. All the time you want.
When, so Stevie was diagnosed with he got his cancer diagnosis in May. Well, he's just sick in May of 2019, and those early appointments. Anytime that there was we turned the corner and there was something else to talk about. Stevie's question, where he'd sit through the whole thing, and turn that light on, please. He'd sit through the whole thing and
there we go.
There we go. With technical assistant. Thank you, Tigger. Stevie would wait till the end of the doctor's presentation, kind of nod quietly, and then he said, okay, but what does that mean as far as going the hall? Going fishing, And boy, that summer he was doing chemo, and times I'd leave here. It'd be a couple hours to get up to Deer Isle, pick him up, go up to the Lafayette Center and Brewer for the chemo sessions, and boy, and when he would leave there, he would still have a pump on a belt, and that would taper off, and 2 days after that he'd have that would come off, and they'd have to go have the line flushed out and all that. So, and that chemo thing, boy, big.
Yeah.
And during this whole period, he still was lobster fishing, right? So, and God bless Tommy Porter, and that could be its own show, but Tommy Porter, who used to fish with Bob Brown, Tommy Porter and his wife had moved up home, and the last couple of years, Tommy fished with my brother, and Wes was the third man, and Tommy and Wes would bring the boat in to the dock in the morning, so my brother didn't have to haul himself up aboard, so 3 o'clock in the morning, they'd bring the boat into the float. Stevie goes down and gets in. But once he was aboard that boat, he felt okay, but I want to tell you this. So I bring him home after one of these chemo days, and I mean, he didn't hardly know we were home, and I get him into the house and up over the stairs, and had to help him get undressed, and he was not doing well. And he had told the crew, we're going to haul, I got to have that chemo today, but we're going to haul tomorrow if there's any kind of a chance. And I'm thinking when I leave him, that he's not going to go fishing the next day. Tommy Porter had gone down to the wharf late that afternoon of the chemo day to make sure that if they did go to haul, they'd have bait the next morning. I think the numbers were 11 boats had gone out from the co-op, and there were 10 crates. Between all those 11 boats, there were 10 crates in total to go out on the truck that night. So 11 boats had landed around 1,000 pounds of lobsters between all of them. It was the early part of the summer and shutters hadn't struck, and it was, pretty grim fishing. So bring my brother home from chemo. He's feeling terrible. And I drive home and I'm thinking, he's not going to go to haul. The next morning, I call the house, I don't know, sometime in the morning. He's out fishing. And his wife, Brucine, says, oh, right, he got up. He was gone at 2:30, whatever it was. So late that afternoon, I call him.
Jesus.
And, he's gotten home. He's had a nap. And I call him and say, you went out? Yeah. How'd it go? Oh, Christ. I felt like hell. Probably shouldn't have gone. We didn't get no amount of gear hauled. We ended up coming in early. Well, two things. My brother coming in early. So that meant they came in, 10:30. Well, they'd been out since 3 or 3:30, so Stevie coming in early, an early day. I think they'd hauled, like 140 some traps, something like that. I think he had like 386 pounds or something like that. So he'd had,
third as all the rest.
Yeah, what
right.
The whole fleet had the day before.
Right.
That was the chemo pump strapped to him. And
God.
That was my brother. Yeah.
Jesus. He was an amazing guy. And I think probably two of my favorite memories of the guy was, first off, that night after I showed the rough cut of the video to all of the two families there in his living room, and then all of you dispersed and all went home. And then he and I stayed up all night long playing guitars and drinking Crown Royal and smoking cigars. And at one point in the middle of that night, I had told him about my first book that I'd written, Coral Reefs and Cold Beers, that I never managed to get published. And I had these two agents and editors that I was working with in New York City, and it had been turned down eventually between the two agents by about 20 different publishers. And I was determined because, they'd said nice things. I was going to get this thing published. And I proudly said to him, it's been turned down by 20 publishers. And then he leaned over me and said, did it ever occur to you you're not a good writer? Which is classic Stevie. And then the other one that you told me about, which is pure Stevie, was the night he wiped out on the black ice on the causeway there in Deer Isle, and the truck went flying, and he ended up with his crushed pelvis laying there on the road in the middle of the night. And when the police finally got up there, he was pulling his body by his elbows across the road to try and get to his cigar.
Well, he was, to be fair, it was, I think, late summer, so there really wasn't any black.
Is that right? Well, that's the story that I heard.
Yeah, no, I mean, and what anybody ought to know is my brother did not drink for the last 25 years of his life, and it didn't make one bit of difference. He was just as funny, and he loved talking about drinking. He never got bitter about it or anything. And it was just a matter of him saying, no, that's foolish. I guess I won't. And that's it. He was just done with it. But no, the story that I always knew was supposedly the first responder said he was lying there on his back. And I just see like a Gary Larson cartoon, 300-pound man lying on his back, the cigar, and flicking the lighter. Trying to light the cigar.
There you go.
Yeah. But Stevie was.
Yeah.
Stevie was Stevie.
Yeah, well, truly matching the larger than life label you hear said for people, but he truly was, and just this loud, boisterous personality, and yet also very artistic and creative and sensitive and multidimensional like that. And you got to see that in that Salt of the Earth film, and that's what was amazing. So that film will live forever. I don't think it'll ever make a cent for anybody, which is just fine with me. We did it for the spirit of the whole thing, and it really, for me, it was an educational exercise, and it was something that I clung on to for the past 25 years in Hollywood, as I've dealt with all these idiots and crap of everything to do in the business. And I had a couple people in film school that they said they were really interested in the culture of different communities. And I said, well, you might be interested in this thing. And their attention spans were too short to even watch it. And, they gave it back. And one woman gave it back and said, I got the feeling this was more about you than it was about the fisherman. No, it wasn't. I had to tell our whole story at the beginning to set it up. And then I handed it over to you guys. But yeah, the first five, well, that's what happened. I think she only watched the first 5 minutes where I was giving the setup. And of course, if that's where you quit, then yeah, it seems to be all about the one guy. Kind of like our conversation here. You got to set these things up, or otherwise they don't make any sense. But that said, got to wrap this thing up. But how's things with the commercial fisheries news these days? And what are you keeping busy with?
We're trucking along, and the world keeps changing, but we kind of changed the format of the paper 5-6 years ago now, where it's a different world now. And what something happens in a management meeting tonight, well, everybody's got it on their eyes something, by midnight, right?
Right.
And so, breaking news, if the paper goes to press tomorrow, you don't read about the thing for another 30 days or something. So we started writing, and it kind of ties in with some of what you've been saying, started doing more stories about people. Rather than reporting straight news. And there has to be management news and things, rules that change and so forth. People need to know that, but they've got a lot of access to that information. So if you can boil that stuff down and condense it and make it easily digestible, put the pages into, people love reading about other people and the people, the boats, the gear. And all of a sudden, once we kind of changed the approach to things, the proof that it was working was we go to a trade show, a commercial fishing trade show, and you'd have all these back issues of the paper, and they'd get cleaned out because it would have a cover story about this fella that they wanted to read about. And it wasn't, what happened at a council meeting 6 months before. It was this human being, and there was no shelf life to it. It was people are people,
Well, and you're the epitome of all that with your columns that you've written and your book Barons, and you've been the voice of the culture so much, which is really amazing. I do have to give you one warning, which is just a few hours ago, after that first time we checked in with you this morning, Ed turned to me and said, you know what, I got to get up there and visit Brian. So that's your warning. Eddie's coming to town sometime in the not too distant future. You won't be seeing me. I'm not looking to travel anywhere these days. I'm enjoying this Zoom life too much. That's as much as I need.
I hate Zoom. This is
sorry about that.
The only reason I would do this is because of you two.
We dragged you onto the Zoom world.
Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, well.
I won't do this with my grandkids. I mean,
yeah.
I am doing this with
hopefully you're talking to us on your iComputer, so we got a little bit of I into your life for today. Welcome to the world. Oh well, Edmundo, you got a final message to Brian with his flip phone there from the 1990s.
It's interesting, Brian. I know we didn't have time to deal with it a lot, but even the documentary and the way that it's made us so happy over the years, it did have an impact on the fishing world in Maine. And I know you've mentioned that a number of times and over the years. And you know, to us, that's the positive side of this. It never was about money, as Randy said, and, you know, he took the brunt of it, but, you know, we all had a lot of time invested in it. But I think it's a snapshot in a really important time in all of our lives. And it's, you know, meeting your wonderful family, Brian. And I think, as Randy said, you know, I mean, I can go sit for a 12-hour coffee session and listen to farmers and, you know, all around the country, because I do a lot of agriculture work right now. I just really respect these people. And I think in this fast-paced world that we live in, sometimes we all look for that instant rush off of seeing a piece of media or a piece of information, where I get more enjoyment of spending, you know, I just spent a couple of days with an individual up in Banff, Canada, and he's talking about, you know, hydrogen and all kinds of different power sources. And I loved it. I love hanging around with very intelligent people. And I love hanging out with the simple folks that I know that have very little education, but a passion for what they do. And I find that makes my life very happy. In fact, when Randy and I were talking earlier, I go, damn, I got to go up and see Brian and Tigger and to go back. I go, okay, shit, I'm coming. I haven't taken a lot of vacation over the last number of years, and I never think about coming up that way, but I just want to let you know that I would love to come back up and pull a little motorhome up your way, and we can sit around and do some visiting, and I would truly love it.
And there is some element of fate at work with this. The idea that Ed was not at all part of this podcast episode until he just showed up out of nowhere on Thursday with his transient global amnesia as an excuse for, hey, I just happen to be here. How about if I join the conversation, which was perfect.
Sorry it happened, Ed, but I'm glad you're here.
That's what I said. It's been great just having him here for 3 days to catch up on everything, because he's always working so hard. We never get the chance to talk at length. And he's been one of my best friends over the years. He's really great with understanding these sorts of things. And I think my final little statement, and I'll let you have the final word, Brian, but my statement on all of this sort of stuff, and 30 years later, after doing that movie, Salt of the Earth, there's a cartoon that was in the New Yorker a number of years ago that I, of course, had to copy and send to tons of my friend, and a few of my really smarter environmental friends that work to save the environment in great big projects. And this cartoon is a guy talking on the phone, and the guy says, I finally realized that making a difference doesn't make a difference. And if all you're doing in life is this belief that I'm going to make a difference, I'm going to save the planet, it's kind of egotistical. Nowadays, I talk to people more and more. You better be doing this stuff for spiritual reasons. You better just believe that this is a cool thing to do in the world for deep inside of you, because you may not get any return on it. We don't know what the future holds for all this crazy stuff. The world is spinning around in different directions these days. And so there'd better be something that you really believe in. For me, my parents, and especially my mother, was such a charismatic person that I do an awful lot of stuff just for her spirit. That's about the depth of it. And I know you feel the same way with your brother. You know, a lot of stuff you would do, not because you have some rational explanation. I've got to do it for this and that to make this sort of money or who knows what. You just do it spiritually. And that's, I think, driven a lot of us on this project. And that's why we never cared to know any metrics on the film. I don't care. You know, we did get lots of people that wrote me emails and letters way back when we first came out with it that were all wonderful. And a lot of the people said you just captured the voice of what we know for the real world of Maine culture, as opposed to somebody's big phony image. So that was enough validation that all we needed. And that's about as much as I have to say. Thank you once again. We've thanked you a million times over the years for taking part in this thing. And that event that we did at University of Maine was classic. And that's on the little website that we built for it. And I'm glad we put that all together. So yeah, final word from Brian.
And that night we were, we had the sound check with John McEwen.
But we won't go into that.
and Ren, folks, if they have a chance to go to the website, they'll see it was so wonderful that as you know, they played the movie on the big screen in the Collins Center. Stevie and I were tucked off to the side behind the curtain. You couldn't see us, but we could see the movie. So we actually watched the movie together which we had not watched that movie together since 1991, you know.
Right.
So 20 years later, we're watching that movie. And, you know, at one point he just reached that big old hand over there, and I just held mine out, and he just squeezed my hand. And he says, "What a life, huh?" And, you know, you guys gave that to us, and that's quite a gift. So thank you both.
You betcha. You betcha. And the icing on the whole cake was what we did that night. And somehow it was also fitting to have that rehearsal before we pulled off our big stunt, and to have John McEwen turn to the whole crew there and humiliate me in front of everybody, saying, "This is what happens when you let a filmmaker design a music event." And just so everybody knows, you ought to watch that one video, because what we did at the end of the movie this was my idea. We put the two brothers and John McEwen, all three with guitars, on the stage behind the screen. And as the end credit music was playing and the credits were rolling on the screen, we cross-faded that music in the movie into the live performance of them singing a song. And then we raised the screen, and the audience, you know, was sitting there and just watched this movie of these two brothers and their father from 20 years ago. And then the screen raised up, and there they were live playing this song, and everybody in the audience was putting the pieces together. Wait, we saw that movie, and then here's these two brothers. Wait a second, that guy's great big with a shaved head, and the other guy's got the silver hair, and I don't know who the other guy in the middle is, but man, they're making some great music. And it all just came off absolutely perfectly. And I never did rub it in on John McEwen, but if he's listening to this, there you go, John. That's what happens when you let a filmmaker put together a really awesome live music event. Turns out to be something a little better than a musician could maybe picture sometimes. So nah. All righty. That's excellent. Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you, Eddie, for being here. Always a good time. And I'm sure there's more chapters to come in the saga of Salt of the Earth and the Robbins brothers.
All right, tell Tigger howdy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both of you.
You betcha. We will be back in touch soon. Thanks. And tune in next week, everybody, for another episode of the ABT Time podcast. And on that note, we are over and out.